Hi, and welcome to Itasca Waters. This is the second in a series of programs we will be airing on ICTV, all on the general subject of shorelands in Itasca County. I'm your host, Brian Whittemore. This program is made possible by the nonprofit organization Itasca Waters and by the financial support of the Blandin Foundation. My guest today is Paul Radomski. Paul is a research scientist for the Minnesota DNR in Brainerd and is Minnesota's lead expert on lakeshore habitat management. And that's what we're going to discuss today as part of Itasca Waters' ICTV series on Shoreland, the aquatic zone. So Paul, thanks very much for talking with us today and welcome. We're honored to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's a good group and I've always appreciated the work that's been occurring up here.
I'll pass that back along when we have our board meeting today.
Yes.
Then. Good, thanks Paul. So let's start broad in the lake itself. Our target, I think, for this program and this series are people, both full-time homeowners and second homeowners that own lakeshore properties in Itasca County and how they can best deal with their property to keep their property values up and also the health of lakes up. And they're one and the same thing, I think. So if you could describe, the aquatic zone sounds like aquatic water, must be the whole lake, but we've been referring to it as something else. So if you can kind of tell us what the aquatic zone is.
Sure. The aquatic zone, as you're referring to it, is what we would call the littoral zone, that near shore area next to the land, out to a depth of maximum plant depth. So usually on most of our lakes, especially in Itasca County, that can be anywhere between 15 and 20 feet where you have maximum aquatic plant depth. We also break it down into the profundal or the deep water zone that, it's the cold water, may have oxygen, may not, and the pelagic zone where most of the people play. The kids are on the tubes playing out in the middle of the lake. But that aquatic zone is where most of the productivity for the lake occurs. So those are places that you want to be very careful with. They're the most sensitive, they're the most easily disturbed, and they're the most important from a perspective of things that we care about, like fish. So protecting that and minimizing your impact in that aquatic zone is a really important thing to do, and we give advice to people how to manage that zone, how to minimize their impact. So that's how we generally break it up, and most people, their interaction is right there on their dock, next to their dock in that aquatic zone. So they probably have a good feel for it. In some cases, the sediment may be rocky, or it could be soft sediment, depending upon their fetch at that area, how much wind that area is receiving, the soils in that area, etc. So it's really a dynamic place. As a biologist and a lake ecologist, we study a lot of what's happening right there in that aquatic zone. So we've done a lot of research in Itasca County. We've looked at, which part of these aquatic zones are the most vulnerable. So we've mapped those to give people advice about, which parts of that aquatic zone are most vulnerable to disturbance. We've studied loons, where they nest. We've done a lot of fish surveys about the habitat they use and whatnot. So it's a fascinating place to look at, and I always encourage people to get underwater and just sit there for as long as they can and just observe, because we're terrestrial, we're sitting at the dock and we don't really appreciate what's really happening underneath the surface of the water sometimes. And I scuba dive, and it's fascinating just to sit and watch, to see the animals come in. You'll see perch and bluegills, interacting with each other. They're using those aquatic plants, which some people don't like, of course, but it's part of nature. Using that essentially as forest. And a lot of fish that we care about, like the sunfish, the crappie, the bass, they all have some affinity for aquatic vegetation, and they use it either to feed on or as cover. So it's really an important place, and I encourage people to get into the water as soon as they can and go and look around and see what you see. And it's more than fish. You know, you can see insects, you can see snails. It's just a wonderful place.
People's cell phones.
Yeah, whatever they drop. I mean, we see a lot of, you know, inadvertent waste or litter that is a problem, and people should fix.
One of the notable things about water as compared to, I think, other environmental things is that if it looks clear, it's fine. You know, I mean, if you don't see a problem, it doesn't exist. So I'm wondering if that's not also a problem with the littoral or aquatic zone, that near shore water that most people experience and that they think about as part of their property, that if it looks clear, they don't have to pay much attention to it. And especially I'm wondering, just to follow up, Paul,
Sure.
on the part about weeds. Our lakeshore, for instance, it's a small lake. There's a sand affluent kind of thing that's happened prior to us being there. So it's about 4 feet deep, maybe 50 feet out. It's all covered with weeds. And the natural desire of a person who doesn't want it in a prop of their pontoon is to take it out. But we obviously haven't done that. But so if you could speak a little bit to a person that was in our...
Yeah, I think it's a general rule that that when you see clear water, that's a good thing. We see with our disturbance of the shoreland, you see nutrients that get into the water, phosphorus primarily. And phosphorus is taken up by algae, and algae can bloom and create a green environment. And people don't like to see green water. They like the clear water, right? So generally, that's a good rule of thumb. If you have clear water, that means you're doing something, at least with regard to nutrients. Now, there are other chemicals that we have to be concerned about, like mercury, which is an important and serious environmental pollutant that we're dealing with across the state. A lot of lakes are impaired with mercury. Getting to your weeds, I don't like to call them weeds. I like to say, you know, they're aquatic plants. You know, they've been there. They've usually, you know, they are adapted to that environment. Weeds are something we consider pests, so your point about being a problem on your prop is well taken. I've spent many hours either with Cara or wild rice on my prop wishing that I hadn't gone into that bay or whatever, and saying I should have not done that. But weeds are a natural phenomenon, important thing for fish habitat, like I mentioned earlier. And they're also very beautiful. I mean, we've got several very common species of aquatic plants that are vascular in that sense that you can pull them out and look at their leaves and whatnot. Coontail is a very common plant. It's probably one that you're dealing with. It's got very finely dissected leaves, serrated edges. It doesn't have roots, but it'll grow. It'll be stuck in the sediment there and providing habitat, providing areas for insects to grow on, snails that the fish will then feed on. So yeah, it can be a nuisance, but oftentimes you can manage nuisances by saying, well, this area I'm going to remove some plants, preferably minimize your impact by removing those where you're actually boating, and enjoy them where they are, right?
The prop kind of takes care of that on its own.
Yeah, some of them, you know, I find that water lilies and boats don't get along. The lily usually loses. Yeah. So, and we've got a diverse amount of plants. Most lakes will have like 20, 30 different species of plants. And unless you're a botanist, you really just don't appreciate the diversity of plants out there. You got anything from a macroalgae, musk grass, they call it, because it has this musky smell. But northern pike will lay its eggs on that musk grass right about now. Usually, when the ice starts going out, the northern pike will lay its eggs on the musk grass. Keep those eggs above the sediment, so it's got oxygen, so that they'll hatch in a couple, a dozen days or so, and produce young northern pike. So there's a lot of value of having those plants. Fish and wildlife habitat. It also holds the sediment in. It provides food. Many of our aquatic plants are food for muskrats or for waterfowl, whether it's wild rice or some of the sago pondweeds are very important for duck food. So we just have to appreciate where they are and manage those little spots where it's a nuisance for us. And we hope people can find that balance where it's possible.
Well, we've left our shoreline as is. It's a natural shoreline, both onshore and off. And last year it produced a nice crop of otter scat at the end of our dock. I think there was like 40 times we had a...
Excellent. What we're seeing is more and more people are keeping it more natural. We used to see a lot of lawn to the lake kind of things, and then they remove all the aquatic plants. And that has a consequence on pollution reaching the lake. So you get 7 to 9 times increase in phosphorus runoff from your shoreland, which then fertilizes your plants in the water or fertilize algae, which is not a good thing. You don't want that.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah. The lake boundary is a fuzzy boundary, right? And the lake is heavily influenced by what's happening up on the shoreland.
Paul, you said something that was really interesting, that in a lake, I would assume no matter the size of that lake, that the near shoreland is the most productive part of that lake.
Right.
That's fascinating. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, if you think of it, especially a larger lake where it's deep water zones, so you have algae, bacteria growing in those areas, and that's some productivity. But if you look at that near shore, that close to the shore area, you've got the aquatic plants that we've been talking about. You've got the insects that are burrowing into that sediment that are there all year long, right? I mean, you probably notice some more in the fall, like when the midges are coming off the lake, and then they breed and then they die again, and you see them on your eaves. But that's where a lot of that insect productivity is occurring, and insects being, just like on land, being the most common animal. It's the same way in lakes. So you've got everything from bacteria to algae to plants to the animals that are all living in that area. And then you take walleye. People love walleye. Everybody loves eating them for sure and loves fishing for them. But look at its life history. So the adults, yes, they have affinity for the bottom of the lake. They're looking for cooler water with oxygen. But come springtime, again, very soon, the mature fish will come up the shore, right in a couple inches of water, and spawn and lay their eggs. And those will hatch in, say, 20 days, and then those young fish are going to feed on the plankton that are out in deep water, and then move into shore again during the middle of the summer and feed on what? They love yellow perch, so they're feeding on yellow perch. The yellow perch are living there. So just look at, if you add up all the productivity that's occurring in that near shore area, it's quite impressive. Whereas you look out in the deep water stuff, yeah, you can find the algae and whatnot, but most of the action is happening right there along the shore.
So if a homeowner were to buy a property or decide over the winter that he or she wants to do some pruning down there and goes, I'm going to buy one of these weed rakes and just clean everything up, they're going to get rid of a lot more than aquatic plants.
Oh yeah, they're essentially altering that whole sediment, and nothing essentially is going to be living in that zone. Yes, you'll have fish moving in and out of there, especially in the dark, diurnal movements, but most of the time that becomes an unproductive spot, much like some of the high energy shores that we have on our lakes, right? You're sitting on some lakes that it's got a long fetch, the wind is there, you've got continuous wave action, you've got sandy soils or rocky soils, and there the productivity is very low as well, and they're just shifting the productivity to something. So we encourage people to say, yeah, if you need that zone, manage it and minimize it as much as possible. And then there's other things like just the trees along the shore, right? Sooner or later they die, and generally they fall towards the lake, right? Because they're leaning into the lake. And it's just amazing how much productivity is associated with those downed trees. Well, when we electrofish for our fish surveys at night, as we approach some of these downed trees that are in the water, you're seeing hundreds of fish all congregating around that area. Why? Because it's a really productive place. You've got all the insects that are living on the twigs, on the bigger branches in the main stem of that tree. And we're at a point when, at least in Wisconsin, my colleagues there, they have to add trees now because people have removed the trees along their shore, and that habitat is gone. And a lot of people take it for granted. It's in my way. So where it's not in your way, leave it. It's a great piece of habitat, something that people don't appreciate. Something as simple as a tree falling in the water makes a big difference.
And it also is a great place to have your lures catch and stuff.
Yeah, it's a great place to find lures.
Well, we just had a neighbor that took down a big white pine that had been damaged by a windstorm last year.
Sure.
And he said the same thing that you just said, so it's nice to have you.
Yeah. If it's a safety issue, just just drop it into the water.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
So, okay, that's very interesting. In terms of, switch gears here a little bit.
Sure.
Riprap. Riprap kind of is on the shoreland itself, but it's kind of involved with the aquatic zone, the near shore.
Right.
What's the state's opinion on riprap, getting stones in there and just...
Yeah, it used to be a very common technique for managing erosion. It probably overused in the past. So the state's advice now is, if you've got a documented erosion problem that can't be solved with natural vegetation and vegetating that again, because the vegetation holds the soil, then it's a reasonable option. But not jumping to the riprap as your first option is the advice we give people. And we give advice to how you could restore that area such that plantings of shrubs and trees and various forbs will better anchor that area, and use that first. It's better, it's long term, it's the minimal effect. So we encourage people to think of it from that angle first.
Let me just briefly reintroduce you. We're talking to Paul Radomski, who's with the state DNR and the state's foremost expert on the near shoreland, the aquatic zone, I'm calling it.
Yes.
And we're honored to have you here today talking about this stuff. Let's talk about property value, because it's not always easy to get a pure environmental message perceived well.
Yes.
I guess I'm being kind here, but
no, interesting you say that, because my colleague and I just finished up a study on the economics and the lake ecology. So we blended a lake model with an economic model. So dollars and value from an ecology perspective. And what we found was that right now the state's spending about 80% of its clean water legacy funds with regard to lakes on impaired waters, those that have a pollution problem. So we're spending 20% on those, or 80% on those impaired waters, and 20% on our beautiful waters to protect those. So our study that blended the economics with the ecology said, you know what? If you were really interested in getting a high return on your investment, a high return on the state's dollars, which are citizens' dollars, is the best investment to be flipped that. Because you get a 6 times increase in return on investment on protecting a high quality lake versus spending that money on impaired water. Now, why is that? Impaired waters are really hard to fix. Once a lake reaches some sort of tipping point, it's really hard to fix it. I mean, you have to do very dramatic things. So if you could protect that lake, and we've shown this, that protection with regard to land values is of real tangible thing to do. So we've just finished something like this up to look at that, because we get that question all the time, is where is it best to invest our money if we're interested in lakes? And we're going, well, probably invest more of it than we're doing now into protecting lakes in this part of the state where you have very high quality lakes.
Right.
The reason why this works out is that people are willing to pay more for clearer water. This goes back to your original point, is if it's clear water, people think it's generally good. So they're willing to pay more for that clear water. And you'll see higher land values in those places with clear water. And then, of course, location, location, and location. But clear water is a big driver in this. So
I would think, Paul, that following up on what you just said about that study, which is neat that you're bringing that up and it's so current, I would guess that a state dollar, goes further protecting good waters than it does to remediate polluted water.
yeah, 6 times as much. Yeah. Yes, very good point. And that's something intuitively, as lake ecologists, we knew, but nobody had put a number on it. So we were going, well, let's actually see how big of this difference is. You know, how important is that general rule that we've been carrying around in our heads? So we've been having conversations with folks, with legislators about this, to say, hey, you know what, maybe it's time to invest some more of our money, because we get a better return on investment in these places like Itasca County.
What do you have any idea, as a result of your study yet, what kind of things that money would be spent on if 80% went toward maintaining healthy water?
Yeah, I mean, there are other programs in the state that have been doing this kind of work in the past. So some of it is using conservation easements, for example. That's where a landowner voluntarily puts some restriction on future development. And that's a great tool to protect some of the real sensitive shorelines. So we've been encouraging counties to think about that, and alerting people like yourselves that live on the lakes to say, hey, you know what, you know, this is an option if you want to create a legacy in that particular area, and you have a large parcel. A conservation easement is a great option to, in perpetuity, to protect that particular sensitive shoreland. So we've been encouraging people to think about that. And there are other things. There are development standards for those sensitive areas that you could consider. And it's just basic education, like what we're doing here, is talking to folks about, you know, how can you minimize your impact so that you can protect that high quality water, which is having an influence on the quality of your land.
Well, one of the things that Itasca Waters, our current initiative, is to inform shoreland owners about ways in which they can increase the health of the lake or maintain the health of the lake and keep their property values up. Mm-hmm. You know, as I said, it seems rather all directly connected.
Right.
But I'm wondering, it seems like it's not easy for a citizen to obtain knowledge. They really have to work at it. And one of the things we're trying to do is, well, through the Shoreland Guide that we produced, and also our website, itascawaters.org, is to make those resources, many of which are the state and especially the state DNR, are easy to reach and then link to, so you can learn things. So what would your recommendations be generally? You referenced, Paul, when we first started talking about how the state educates people. What would you recommend that lakeshore owners do to examine good ways of protecting their property or enhancing their lake?
Yeah, that's a good question. What we've been talking about, and I've written a book on this whole topic in itself, is from a perspective of a homeowner who's there mostly to have fun and recreate, or to enjoy, you know, their life and enjoy the scenery. There are a couple of things you can, you know, principles that you can do. Is one, protect your assets, right? You're on your lake. Protect it so your runoff isn't influencing the quality of your water on your lake lot. You know, manage that water so it gets into the ground near where it falls. Simple principle, very helpful. So protect your assets. That might not only include water quality, but it may protect screening, right? You're there. The lake is public. How can you plant trees or keep the trees you have to provide that screening? So that's one, protect your assets. And when you're building a home on it, is really think about long and hard, where do you site where do you place that home? Not only from a rural and regulatory perspective, but so that you're minimizing the impact on that site. So protect your assets. Then you add assets, right? So what value can you bring? It might be adding to the native vegetation there, such that you do a better job of protecting that shoreline. It could be your docks, minimizing your impact, right? Of course, we have rules and regulations for docks, but much of it's common sense. It's not too far out. It doesn't create a hazard. So minimize that dock and minimize your footprint, your impact in that near shore, the area that we've said is the most sensitive. And then the third principle you can think about is connectivity. How do you bring yourself, how do you bring your kids or your grandkids so that they're using that near shore area, so that they're not damaging some areas, but using it, because we all love to swim and have fun in the lake. So it may be, hey, here's the best spot on my lot for those kinds of activities, and I'm gonna put most of my impacts in that area rather than spreading it out 100 feet or 200 feet. So making sure that you protect your assets, you create some assets, and then you bring some connectivity so that people can enjoy that nature. And it might be simply just having a place to sit and enjoying nature, not necessarily on a dock, but so that you can see the loons and the wildlife that you can see on these lakes up here, which is really beautiful to see.
Yeah, let beauty be beauty. Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Paul, an open question here, because we've only got about 3 minutes left.
What?
Believe it or not, I know it was a very fast 30 minutes. What haven't I asked you that you need to speak about?
Oh, well, I could spend all day talking about lakes. You had mentioned earlier when we were just talking before this started is curiosity, and I think that's a good thing for people to have. Is look at your shoreline, see something that you may not understand. It might be something as simple as a dragonfly larva, and you go, what is that? And you realize that dragonfly larva might had to live in that area, your area, for the last 2 years, and then it'll come out, become a dragonfly, and it may fly all the way to New Mexico if it's a common green darner. So you remain curious about things, and if you have questions, especially with rules and regulations, there's rules for managing the aquatic plants along shore. There's rules for docks, as we just mentioned. There are rules, and if you have questions, talk to somebody in the DNR. Now, the DNR's rules usually go below the ordinary high water mark, which is a technical term, but people can generally tell where that is, where you see the water level signs along the shore. But talk to the DNR. If it's activity above that ordinary high water mark or above the water line, that's managed by your county or local government. Talk to those folks. They've got some great programs about how you can better manage rainwater, how you can manage the vegetation, etc. So remain curious and minimize your impact, which we've been stressing, and learn and get in the water and look at things and see things.
And by the way, all this that you're talking about is actually fun. I mean, it makes your life on the lake even more fun.
Oh,
to have more nature around.
Well, yeah, isn't it? I always find it's like I might be birding and saying, well, what bird is that? And knowing what that bird is, and then asking the question, well, where is it living during the most of the winter, or where is it living in the summer? Just remaining curious about those kinds of things, I think, brings a fuller life and makes you understand that you're living on the lake for a reason, and it's usually because of nature. And the more you appreciate that, the better off you are. Now, some people appreciate like some of the very charismatic ones, right? Like the loon. I mean, how many times do we hear loons in movies when there's no lakes there, right? I mean, how many times do you see that?
Too many.
Yeah, and we studied loon nesting in Itasca County and looked where those occur, and they have a high return rate on those sites. And but keep your distance, and if it's something like a loon, get to know some of it. Where does it live? Where does it nest? And they're very specific spots, and they're not sandy beaches. So get to better understand your lake. And there's a lot of information on your lake on the DNR's website by Lake Finder. You can find information on the fish, you can find information on the water chemistry. So there's a lot of information out there. If you're curious, you can readily find it. And you can always call people like myself.
And I would urge too, ItascaWaters.org, which links to a lot of the contacts that Paul is talking about. There is a wealth of information out there we should take advantage of. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been really cool. That's it. We got our 30 minutes taken care of. And
we could start over and do it all over again.
We'll just keep going. Well, anyway, thanks, Paul. My guest has been Paul Radomski of the state DNR, Minnesota's lead scientific expert on lakeshore habitat management. Thank you again.
Thank
it's been
you.
Great. If you would like more information about Itasca County shorelands, how to keep your shoreland healthy and maintain or grow your property's value, you can go to our website, ItascaWaters.org. The site has tons of useful links to all kinds of resources, simple to navigate, and our next program will deal with the shoreline itself and what a lakeshore owner can do to minimize or prevent pollutants from flowing into their lake. Check ICTV listings for when that program will air. I'm Brian Whittemore. Thanks for watching Itasca Waters.